Hey everyone, welcome back to the latest episode of the Inside Crypto Podcast. We have not had an interview for a very long time. It's almost been about a month. I'm so glad that Tom Trowbridge is the first person we get to interview for 2024. Tom is an accomplished business builder and Web3 focused entrepreneur and co-founder and CEO of Fluence Labs. Fluence Labs has developed an institutional grade decentralized serverless computing network that frees computation from centralized cloud providers. So if you've gone back to 2023, listen to some of the episodes that we ended up that year on, you would know decentralized serverless computing is a big theme, I think, for 2024. But before we get into the technical stuff, we have to talk about Tom, his background, what he's doing now, why he's where he is.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here. Listen, I'm old, it goes back a long way. So I'll skip to the interesting part, which is the blockchain and crypto experience I have. But I started off, I guess, my career quickly in technology and telecom, but on the banking side. And then in 2014, 15, started paying a lot of attention to Bitcoin and crypto. And in 2016, discovered Hedera Hashgraph. And in 2017, joined 𝕋𝕚𝕤𝕗, and that was basically a white paper and helped them found and build what became, that was called Swirls at the time, but helped them found and build what became Hedera Hashgraph. And so that was a full-on intense experience of building the team, raising the money, getting the council members on board, setting up the whole governance structure, doing the regulatory meetings with the SEC. And it was incredibly interesting because it was a high-profile DLT, different than other ones out there, headed by two very accomplished technologists who were terrific at explaining and educating what they did and still do. And so that was a great experience and introduction into the space. I left there in 2019 and joined Fluence Labs as a founder. And that has been full-time on Fluence ever since.
Wonderful. Like you said, let's just get straight into it, right? You mentioned Fluence. What makes someone, Hedera is super famous. We had Zenobia Gottschalk on last year talking about Hedera. What made you break away from this big established thing and said, okay, I'm going to do this thing
It's
on
funny.
my
It's
own?
funny that you,
Why go that route?
it's a great perspective because yes, Hedera is big. We raised at a big valuation. It's a top 30 coin. I frankly think it should be a top 10, but that's a longer conversation. But we always felt like we were the underdogs at Hedera. And I still think Hedera is the underdog in terms of perception. So yes, from one side, it's the big thing, certainly from the Fluence perspective. But to back up for a second, when I joined what became Hedera, we did our first raise at a 50 million valuation. The next was a 250 million. The big raise was a 6 billion, right? So I joined that when it was just a white paper and people had some idea of the technology, but I joined it when no one was really aware of it. All the big venture firms turned us down in the beginning, every single one, of whether it was Andreessen or Sequoia or whatever. And so Founders Fund, et cetera. So that was a small, relatively unknown project at the time. And so there was a risk to doing that, but they were solving a great problem and it was a great team and very compelling technology. Fluence, I feel, is very similar with incredibly smart, brilliant founders and solving a different problem, but it is also super important. And we started the same trajectory of raising at higher levels. And so now we have a terrific capital base and terrific investor base. And I'm very excited for what this can do. And for me, building it is the fun part. That's the hard part. And the fun part is taking it from an early stage idea to a much more well-known established. That's the hard work, but that's where you create a lot of value. And that's the fun thing. And so that's why I was excited to join Fluence and take another crack at building something again.
That's a very good reason. And I totally understand, Tom.
Fluence solves the decentralization of compute. And so why is that a problem? And so you have to take a step back and think about where compute happens and what the cloud is. And so the internet and computation started off with servers in pretty much offices, right? Big mainframe servers. And then it moved into people's houses with the PC revolution, but it was still very localized. And starting in the late 90s, the concept of the cloud started to percolate, data centers. And then Amazon started popularizing the cloud in the early 2000s. And we've seen a huge shift from companies moving and hosting applications and all of their data and computation in-house to the cloud. And they've done that to save money. It's been added, probably enhanced security. And so there's real benefits to this, right? Economies of scale. Amazon can operate data centers probably more professionally than XYZ furniture company or whatever it is, right? So that makes sense. But the problem is that you then end up with pretty much monopoly/oligopoly economics. And so you have incredibly high margins at Google, Amazon, and Microsoft that control maybe 60, 70% of the web. And so we're headed down a path of decentralization thanks to crypto. And so we have decentralization of payments. We have Bitcoin, Ethereum, everything else, and decentralization of storage, which we have via Arweave and Filecoin, among others, but we don't have compute. And so all of Web3 still runs on Amazon, with the exception of kind of DeFi and smart contracts, which is super decentralized, and that's a different story. But your general applications still run on the cloud. And the problem with the cloud is that it is still pricey. It is still a single point of failure. They still have the ability to terminate you for a perceived or real breach of their 60 or 80 page terms of service that they can interpret how they want. And the real point is that all of your information and data is stuck in a particular provider. And so when you decentralize it, you both are able to save money. We think on Fluence, using Fluence will be about 80% cheaper than the clouds. That's huge. But the real exciting thing is that you then can move all of your application, all your data from one provider to another incredibly quickly and easily and seamlessly. And that allows a level of innovation that was hard to understand, because right now, if you build on Amazon or Google, you're pretty much constrained to the packages and software that they offer. And so you can add other things, obviously, if you want, but it's not simple to do. And so we are envisioning and building this open ecosystem of computation, which enables this open cloud where applications can build on each other. The applications can continue to run regardless of whether the author has turned them off or not. So you can continue to build and build in a way that we think will inspire a whole nother level of innovation.
That's exciting. And you've touched on a lot of points that we talked about last year. So Tom, let's take this a step further, right? You've mentioned the cost savings. And again, at this juncture in today's podcast, I would encourage people to pause, go to the Fluence website, check them out there. You have a lot of cool data on your website. Come back, continue listening.
By the way, it's
the big problem I find.
Fluence.network is the website, just so we're clear.
No problem. Fluence.network. Yes. Is convincing people to say, okay, I'm going to stop using Azure. I'm going to stop using Google Cloud. I'm going to stop using AWS, right? And I'm going to switch to Fluence. Like, how do you convince people? Is this on a one-to-one basis? Are you meeting people? Are you doing conferences? Of course, podcasts and media appearances like this, of course, play a role. What's the push to convince people?
I think there are a couple paths. So first let's back up. First, we need to launch the network. And so we're launching the network on February 27th. And so the first at ETH Denver. And so the first step here is to prove that it works at scale. And so we have thousands of CPUs from a lot of providers all over the world that are interested in joining this network. So the first thing is we have to show that there is compute capacity for people to use. That's the first, I think. And then from there, there's different paths. There is a philosophical alignment with what Fluence is doing. And that is one vein of approach, and that's very Web3 focused. And there are a number of applications. You can think of applications like Hedera, which are foundational to Web3, that have a decentralization initiative going on right now, for which Fluence is very well suited. And they will decentralize. They don't want to be on AWS. No one in Web3 wants to be on AWS. They're just looking for the appropriate solution. And I think Fluence is that. There may be others down the road, but right now I think we're the best. And so if there's a philosophical need to do this and alignment, and that's point one. But to your kind of implied other question, price and also verifiability, because this is all, by the way, off-chain compute, and we use blockchain just to verify, validate, and reward. but the low price and verifiability we think is applicable to the broader Web 2 market. And so you think of big use cases of serverless compute, like computation for episodic computation, like sporting events, where there's enormous amount of data capture and then analyze it from video to whatever it is, to pharmaceutical trial analyzing, to gene sequencing type data, where that is not time sensitive, but is price sensitive. So all of those traditional Web 2 uses, we think ultimately will make sense on Fluence, partly for the cost savings. But if you're spending $1 million on compute, if you can save $500,000 or $800,000, it doesn't matter how big the company is, that bottom line matters to whoever's P&L that is in. And that's what we're going to be going for. And we're not there yet, but that's where we go. And that's what's so exciting about this and what we're doing is that this isn't just a Web3 application or Web3 use, but doing this right and doing this well has implications as big as the cloud. And we don't get there tomorrow, right? Like this takes time. There's a variety of steps we have to go through and development we need to continue doing, but that's where we go with this. And that's what's exciting. And so there's different channels to get to those different types of customers. With the Web3 being the early ones that philosophically aligned the ecosystems and communities that we know, to your point, and then proving that, and then adding some more tools and adding some more features, and then beginning to transition into to move to the larger scale, more Web 2, just traditional company users ultimately.
Okay. You mentioned hardware, and as the computer geek in me wants to know is like, are you guys buying AMD EPYC CPUs and setting up your own server racks somewhere, or is this being provided?
Yeah, so that's actually the critical point as to why is this cheap, right? Why would it be cheaper? And this gets into the whole concept of DePIN, decentralized public infrastructure networks, right? And so this is the sector that we're in, and it's super exciting. And what DePIN is, and what we're doing as a project in it, is you're creating a software layer and combined with blockchain validation and verification and crypto economics that allow crowdsource of infrastructure, and that infrastructure to then be put together in a network that functions and is resilient and works as if it is one company, even though it's all decentralized, right? And then is rewarded and incented the appropriate way. And so what that means for us is we buy nothing. Filecoin buys no hardware. Helium, the decentralized kind of IoT and now telco network, buys no hardware. And what DePIN does, what we do, is we just provide the incentives for people and companies that have excess infrastructure, whatever kind it is, to contribute it to our network. And so for us, to be clear, it's less people's laptops or servers at home. It's actual data centers that have excess unused compute capacity for which if they can cover the cost of electricity and make a margin, that's a win versus it just sitting idle. And so that's what we're targeting. And so the customers I'm talking about, and the providers I'm talking about, the 2,000 plus CPUs I'm talking about, are from data centers. And some of these we've toured them. They're top tier data centers that Netflix and Facebook are hosted in, but where there's excess capacity and they want to monetize. And the thing that Fluence does, this is where the software layer comes in. If they turn that off, whatever application is using that moves automatically to the next most suitable host, wherever it is. And so that means two things. It means that anyone can join for periods of time and they don't have to sign up for a long time. But it also means that they don't have pricing power because they try to do something else, raise prices, whatever. The company just moves to another provider. And so it ends up being a global network that effectively sources or drives price to just above marginal cost. And that is what DePIN effectively does, is it sources globally all this excess infrastructure and then creates a network of it that basically commoditizes that infrastructure, right? And so when that's all commoditized, the price falls to the lowest possible level because the margin goes away and the margin goes back to the customers. And that was what makes this so compelling. And so that's where this low price comes from, is it comes from providers who have excess compute that are looking for ways to monetize it for any duration.
To quickly summarize, right? So you've seen some providers, right? And if someone is listening to this or watching a YouTube video later and they're like, oh, this is interesting. I'm a data center out in Belgium somewhere. We do have extra capacity. Is it as simple as contacting you and saying, hey, we'd like to participate in this idea? Or is it this an online application that they fill out and it's done
Right now
automatically?
we
How does
have
it work?
you can go to our site, fluence.network, and you can fill in a couple of questions about where you are, the amount of capacity you'd like to add now and over time. And so at the very early stages, we are launching with a number of providers and are going to be ramping that up as we grow capacity. We will get quite quickly to a stage where anyone can join easily and without interacting with us whatsoever. At this stage, which is right before we're launching, it does require a manual and a kind of an interaction, as we're at the very early stage of just setting up and want to make sure everything is functioning correctly. But if you go to our site, you can fill in some information and then we're in touch with you. And it just, as we get more and more accustomed to this, it gets more and more automated.
That makes sense. Tom, I wanted to ask about this because this has been in the news and the media the last 3 months, is the idea of LLMs and training them on cloud data and how expensive that is, how bad that is for the environment, etc. And maybe perhaps the idea of decentralized computing can aid that cause. Is this a market that's interesting to Fluence, or is this, am I totally wrong? Does this apply to
No, it
decentralized
does in
computing?
a couple different ways. And LLMs, though, are mainly trained on GPUs. Fluence right now is CPU focused. Our next big development will be adding this technology and making it suitable for GPUs, which is not a big lift, but we have other things to do first. But so that's one point. It's not optimal for training, but it's important for two things. First, there's actually three things. Cleaning the data, so making sure the data pipelines are consistent and appropriate for the training. That's point one, which is relevant. The other thing that it is very important for is validating the data it was trained on and verifying it. And so Fluence is verifiable compute. So you can prove that this data was the data that was used. And if you think about the New York Times lawsuit to right, like their claim, right? So what's going forward is the LLMs are going to have to, as just defense mechanism, be able to prove where they source their data from, or else they'll be the risk of being sued by XYZ media outlet going forward. So that verifiability is another key point of what Fluence can do. And the last thing, which also is super important, this is where I think the future is running these models in a decentralized way. And so with the centralized ones, ChatGPT has gotten some criticism for the, let's just say, for the not the manipulation, but for the forcing of certain answers. And so there's you can call it censorship, you can call it bias, you can call it whatever it is. And as these LLMs become bigger and become sources of truth, the push from companies and governments to make sure the answers fit a particular narrative is only going to increase. And companies are going to be forced and compelled and pushed and pulled to manipulate and force answers a certain way. And I think that's going to erode trust in LLMs. And a decentralized LLM that has verifiable data that was trained on X data, so you know it's trained on that data, and then it runs decentralized. There's no one to pressure, influence, or coerce to make it answer something. I think those become the actually more trusted LLMs than the ones run by the large established companies that have to play ball with regulators and the public.
Yeah, that's definitely something I've heard along those lines as well. Okay. Continuing on this sort of thought pattern, Thomas, is like, why creating Fluence, right? You would have seen the start of ChatGPT 2 years ago, maybe, and then Microsoft getting involved and becoming a $3 trillion company on the backs of AI, allegedly. Why go the CPU route? Why not just immediately jump
only
into
because
GPU
we
route?
started this way longer ago. And we started this more than 3 years ago. This started building this technology back in like 2017, 2018. And so obviously these models and this AI was being developed then, but we were not so much in the loop on that. And the other point is that while the growth rate of GPU usage is like this, CPUs still account for 98 whatever percent it is of computations on the web, right? If you're using Netflix is trying to figure out what movie to show you next, they're not using GPUs. If Uber is trying to calculate the fastest route, they're not using GPUs. Pinterest is figuring out what pictures to show you. They're not using GPUs, right? So all the web runs on CPUs, and that's not going away. GPUs are going to grow dramatically. And the other thing about GPUs is that they're in such short supply that there is less of a, what's the phrase? There's more pricing power for GPUs. And so the marketplace of GPUs is not, I don't think is as compelling a cost savings necessarily as it is in the CPU world, where it's more commoditized and there's just far more scale.
Yeah, that makes sense. Going back to probably during COVID times, I remember trying to buy a 3070 or 2070 at that time, and the price was like 200% over MSRP, and it was honestly terrible as a retail customer. Coming from like a corporate customer, building GPU racks or something like that would be terrible. So it makes sense. Okay, jumping back onto the Fluence, talked about the idea of censorship, right? And serverless computing and anyone familiar with crypto is quite familiar with the idea. The advantage of decentralization is no one can say, you're out, we're done, we're not serving you anymore, right? Why is this so important when it comes to?
Why is it important to us philosophically? Or
philosophically, as let's go philosophically.
I guess I'd say that is one of several things that are important to us, as we are not a group that is out there on the anarchy side of the spectrum that is saying everything, there should be no rules, the governments shouldn't exist. That's not the philosophy here. It's more about, it's more about our concern about the centralization of power and influence by only a few companies. And that's more of the issue that we have, because when you have that much control and influence, you almost don't even have to use it because everyone's already scared of it. And so the internet was about democratization of information and of access. And yet the problem, which I think Tim Berners-Lee never contemplated and couldn't have done anything about anyway, is that because it's global, it rewards scale. And so inevitably it moves to scale. And that's nobody's fault. That's just an economic sort of law. And so you need decentralized systems in order to help prevent or to alleviate that inexorable move towards oligopoly, monopoly dominance in the world of that. And so when you have that, you have higher prices and you have this sort of censorship or just influence potential, which we just don't think is good for anyone or any company to have.
No, and I agree with you. And somebody who, we talk about Reddit sometimes, and I've seen Google Cloud Reddit bills and thousands on thousands of dollars, and it's terrible, right? Thomas, in the future, do you potentially see, as one of the founders of Fluence, you guys being on the same level as Google and Microsoft in terms of being at that size of decentralized serverless cloud computing provider, being this big behemoth?
Listen, it won't be in 5 or 10 years. It'll take longer than that. And the cloud took a long time to get to where it is today. So it'll take longer. But importantly, Fluence can't be a behemoth. The network could be, but we can't. And Fluence Labs as a company is just a service provider to the network. And so I would love Bitcoin is a behemoth, right? But it's just a protocol out there, right? And there's no one company, right? So that's the type of thing that we're trying to build, is a network and a protocol that allows this type of computation to happen. And we want to help that, and we want to build that and help make it be successful. But ultimately, we want a lot of other people to be participating in building that as well. And so I would like the Fluence network to be very big, very widely used, and be a decentralized standard, if you will. That would be terrific. That'd be fabulous. That's way more than 5 years away, to be clear. But if we're able to get to 10% of the size of Google and Amazon, that would be a big success. And that, I think, would then propel us far further. But it's about the network success and the network being used, not like, it's not Fluence Labs, if that makes sense.
It does, right? And we've had founders come on and tell us about this, like they're, again, into the ethos of decentralization, like they're helping this network be created and then it takes off on its own. It's a lofty goal to be the same size as Google, right? But it's also a difficult goal to be 10% the size. Do you see any hurdles along the way?
Oh,
hitting that 10%
I don't even
size?
know where to start with the hurdles. There are all kinds of hurdles, but there's technical development hurdles, and we will get through those. Question of time. And then there's adoption cycles, which you mentioned early on in the conversation, which is another thing. So both of those are the two main things that we can get through, and both will take time. And I think the way I guess I phrase it is that if we get to even 5 or 10% of any of the clouds, then we get way bigger. Because if we get to that level, then we're really, and by the way, these markets are enormous, right? We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. And so if Fluence is doing 10 billion, 20 billion worth of compute on its network, right? Which just say 10 as an example, at 80% cheaper, that means you're actually doing 80-ish billion, right? Versus, right? So maybe, I don't know, you got to figure out what your metric is here, but say it's even 5 billion, you are then you've proven that to a massive level. And I think you get a lot bigger. So if we're able to get, I just pick a number like $1 billion worth of compute on Fluence, that means it's going a lot higher. And so that is an enormous goal. 100 million seems super far away, obviously, right? But first you get to 1 million, right? You just block and tackle to get there. And that's what we're trying to do. But once we get to some level of scale, it will be clear that this can be very, very widely adopted, which would be super exciting.
Of course. And I love the analogy you ended off with, right? It's just, think about the actual savings that are happening. And while you're doing this value, but the actual value is something much larger. Thomas, we've talked about DePIN, we've talked about Fluence, we've talked about what you're doing, we've talked about the ETH Denver, which is happening soon. I know one of our founders will be there as well to give a speech. Would you like to quickly plug who, are you giving a speech at ETH Denver or someone else?
We're actually doing a DePIN day on February 27th at ETH Denver.
Oh, nice.
So it's a DePIN day, and we're also doing the Fluence launch as part of that day. So we have a terrific lineup of speakers for that day, which we're very excited about. And I think DePIN is really a terrific use case of blockchain and crypto economics. And listen, some projects like Filecoin, Arweave, et cetera, have been out there doing this for years. And now people are like, oh, DePIN, but Helium is another one, right? But there's decentralized Uber coming down the pike, Teleport. There's a variety of others, right? DePIN can be cars. It could be a lot of different things. So I think this is a super exciting use case of blockchain and crypto. And so I'm excited about that day. That's the main thing I'd plug. And we're obviously we think we're a big piece of this, but there's lots of other, way more advanced players than us in different areas here.
Cool. All right. Then in today's video, I'll make sure to include the link for ETH Denver. In particular, you mentioned February 27th. So people can go, if they're in Colorado, right, they can go check that out. Or hopefully it'll be, I believe it was online last year, so they can check it out online like I can, because I'm not flying to America anytime soon from Taiwan. Wonderful. Thomas, it has been an awesome conversation and so interesting. We've talked about a lot of stuff. And before we end up today's episode, is there anything you want people to do to take action off? Or is there anything you want people to go and read? Of course, go to fluence.network, check it out. Final words, again, take as much time as you want. It's evening here, so
I guess I'd say website's great, but definitely go Fluence_project is our Twitter X account, and also Telegram. So join those communities for sure. That'd be terrific. And listen, I would love everyone to be paying attention to what we're doing on February 27th and afterwards. And we love all the support and all the help that we can get. And I think the last thing I'd say is that decentralized compute has to work, because if it doesn't, we're going to live in a world dominated by Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, which is effectively run by governments, right? So you don't have to be an anarchist to know that having a couple of companies basically controlling everything can't be good. And so I think what we're doing is helpful for everyone, for everything. And so and by the way, if other projects do a better job of it, great. We want that to work also. But think about this as a real important mission to help decentralize the last key missing centralized component of the internet.
Nice. That is a great way to end up today's episode. Tom, thank you so much for your time. I'll be including, of course, Fluence's socials. Is there anything you want to include from your personally, like your X,
Yeah, I'm Tom
LinkedIn,
Tro. That's easy. And my website is tomtro.com, but I'm either Tom Tro or the Tom Tro, depending on what platform.
Sounds good. I'll make sure to include that as well. Thank you again. This episode will be out in roughly the 22nd on a Wednesday. So please keep an eye out for that. And don't forget to check out Tom's shorts, which will be out on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube and TikToks. If you are a big fan of short content, I know a certain age group is. Check that out. And then stay tuned for March's interview. Tom, thank you again. And
great. Thanks so much. Great being here. Thank you.
Thank you.